I have this rule where if I get 1 hour per Canadian dollar spent out of a game, it was worth the investment. The first 3 games I played after I made this rule were Breath of the Wild, Xenoblade 2, and Smash Ultimate, and those games easily let me clock over 90 hours, which is the normal Canadian retail price. However, as I continued to be a slave to capitalism, I realized the 3 games above were the exception and definitely not the norm. Most games I bought since then, I could barely get 50 hours out of. So I relaxed the rules to 2 Canadian dollar per 1 hour spent, which is where the rule currently stands. And the reason why this is relevant is, a couple months ago, I saw Tactics Ogre Reborn on sale on Steam for like $30, so I thought to myself, hey, isn't this the game that supposedly defined the Fire Emblem genre that I so love, along with Final Fantasy Tactics? On Steam it calls itself the crowning jewel of the genre. And yeah, I'll probably get like 15-20 hours out of this, and oh my god, how wrong I was. I'm 150 hours in, and I haven't even completed a full playthrough of the post-game content yet. The playtime isn't particularly inflated by grind or anything, the game simply has that much content. At its core, beneath a heap of content, customizability, and everything, there is a very fun grid-based SRPG that scratches the itch that Fire Emblem leaves. Or should I say Fire Emblem scratches the itch that Tactics Ogre Reborn leaves, because TOR is technically the progenitor of the genre. This game came out 30 years ago, and the current version that's on Steam is a remake of a remake from, I don't know, like 10 years back, but I want to say it still holds up very well. The reason I'm making this video is because I want to yell into the void that's YouTube with my thoughts about this game. None of my real-life friends are SRPG nerds like I am, so I didn't want to rave about a genre they didn't care too much about. I'm also currently between games, so I wanted to take a break and work on a different project. Okay, so here goes nothing. I'm going to rattle off a bunch of things that are top of mind for me as someone that started the genre with Fire Emblem and now branching into the classics. There will be praise and there will also be pain points. Some of my critique are probably personal bias. I'm pretty sure they are personal bias. But some of them I feel like are legitimate UX UI related concerns. But note that none of the knocks I have on this game change the fact that this game was nothing short of amazing. I had a fantastic 150 hours put into it so far, and I look forward to finishing the rest of the post-game stuff after a break. I'm gonna be completely honest, the first maybe 2 to 3 hours of this game was kind of rough. This game is a little clunky to learn and definitely a little clunky to play. It's a remaster of a 30-year-old game, and it definitely shows. Given the game's age, I really don't hold this sentiment against it. If anything, it makes me appreciate the type of unspoken user experience standards that modern SRPGs basically agreed on. I went from Engage to Triangle Strategy to Persona 5 Tactica, and all the controls, how the camera moves, and where to find certain details were all pretty consistent. When I dropped into Tactics Ogre Reborn, I struggled to find things and navigate the menu. In the battle, the camera felt stiff, and when using the D-pad to move, your cursor felt kinda iffy as well. However, I discovered that playing with a solo mouse and a bit of keyboard for the shortcuts was the best way to go about it. It's a pretty menu-heavy game, so being able to click around quickly is such a godsend. I haven't checked out the speedrun for this game yet, but I would bet that it would be played on a mouse. Elevation. This is a cool feature that breaks my brain a little bit as a predominantly Fire Emblem player. Fire Emblem has a recurring juggernaut problem where it's easy to sit an unkillable unit at a choke point and turtle your squishy units behind them. Most attacks in Fire Emblem are just 1-2 range, and terrain is either you can traverse it or you cannot. When the y-axis comes into play, ranged attacks or items get more distance going downhill and less going uphill. You can't brain dead choke a point anymore because there are numerous ways to flank around the terrain. You can't brain dead turtle behind a tank either because ranged units from high ground can rain arrows at your backline. I won't go into details, but just know that fundamentally this changes both defensive and offensive geometry of the game. From an implementation standpoint, it's a hit or miss, really. There are some maps where the elevation really enhances the map design, but there are also some maps where it just feels like a cheap way to inflate the difficulty. Overall, I enjoy the elevation mechanics in general. It exercises a different type of muscle in my brain, and I like that. Another anti-turtling mechanic are the random buff cards that spawn on the map. They're pretty powerful, and they're definitely worth fighting over. To be honest, I feel like some characters don't really come online until you've picked up maybe one or two of those. Specifically, I feel like mages need the skill activation chance or the MP recovery buff to be any useful in a given map. Since MP is charged over time and you start with nothing, and MP recovery items are a finite resource, if your mage doesn't hit meditate proc at the start, they could be doing nothing for 2 to 3 turns. These buffs are also why I love playing Tabarn, Canopus. With his mobility, it's super easy for him to pick up a few cards at the start of the map and quickly snowball. Since his base class is a Fizz Magical Hybrid class, there isn't really a buff that is going to be wasted on him. However, when I read through Reddit, it's clear that some people really don't like this mechanic, but I thought it was an interesting thing, and it encourages you to actually play the game instead of just turtling in a corner. Speaking of things that people don't really like, union levels. This is perhaps the most polarizing mechanic that all other mechanics come secondary to. Union level is your level cap that's tied to story progression. In application, it means you cannot power level your characters to trivialize the game. I tend to find that when you hit your union level cap, your stats are basically on par or slightly behind your enemies. The reason this is the most important mechanic, in my opinion, is because the game essentially forces you to engage with other mechanics to make up for the stat deficit. This is a new addition to either Reborn or the PSP remake, and I'm pretty sure it's kind of unpopular because I keep seeing mods out there that removes this. For me personally, I really didn't like it at first, but I got kind of used to it. This actually ties in with my next point about mechanics, and it's about how many mechanics there actually are. There are a lot of mechanics in this game, and it makes it fun, complex, and challenging. But the thing is, the game chucks all of them at you at the same time, and it does not adequately explain what they do. During chapters 1 and 2, these mechanics don't really matter because you can pretty much strategy brute force your way to Ws. However, in chapter 3 and definitely in chapter 4, I don't remember, the difficulty spikes significantly, especially with the union level cap. And you need to wring every drip of advantage you can get from every last mechanic to pull through the fights. In my playthrough, this is the part where I went back to the in-game guide to read about certain mechanics. I realized I needed to start stacking debuffs on the bosses or I'm just gonna die. So I tried to look up which debuffs were which, and the in-game tutorial doesn't really tell you. The buff-debuff section was pretty egregious. The list of debuffs in the guide was incomplete and it admits it as such. Then Warren has the audacity to tell you to hover over the tooltip when you get inflicted. Like, my brother in Christ, I want to know what this does before I get hit by it, not after. There's also this damage type thing that I just never figured out, and to be honest, it's the one mechanic that I never engaged with actively when I was playing. I heard it was also bugged, but I cannot confirm because, once again, I never figured it out. But in a nutshell, there are 3 damage types: crushing, stabbing, and slashing, and each armor type has resistance to one type. I don't know. Bottom line is, if the preview tells me that I'm projected to do pitiful damage to an enemy, I'm just going to assume I'm using the wrong damage type. What this feels like is, it's as though there's a guide that goes over these type of stuff. That's why it's not in the game itself. Like, you know those booklets that used to come in the game boxes that they stopped doing? The more I thought about this idea, the more plausible it sounded because there is just so much stuff in this game that just doesn't get explained. But ultimately, I went with the arguably better option, which was I just googled it. And anyways, back on topic. The one mechanic that I did really like though was the elements mechanic. It's basically an expanded Pokemon starter type rock, paper, scissors, but 5 ways, and it forces you to have a lot of units to ensure you have sufficient type coverage. This ties in well with the fact that there are a lot of classes and weapons, so you are forced to train up a lot of different units and experiment. I do find that you run into a lot of air and ground type enemies, meaning to counter those, you'll be deploying your own ice and air units quite a lot. I'd say the MVP of my playthrough would be Tabarn, Canopus, because he's recruited with the air element and he's a flying unit that picks up all the buff cards. And he's also magic and physical hybrid, so he's a mixed sweeper. Going into the game blind, I set my denam as water type, which I found to be really useless from start to finish. I keep thinking I'm going to start running into more fire enemies, but I keep getting air and ground, so Tabarn is hitting big DPS all game long while denam is stuck doing chip damage. I was also a bit hesitant to reclass denam since I didn't know any better about the game. And I thought my lackluster protagonist was just a result of me not understanding the mechanics of the game, and honestly, that's correct, because if I knew the mechanics of the game, I would change his element to ice or something and reclass him out of warrior into rune fencer or something else. Just as a quick aside to set up for my next point. Before playing Tactics Ogre, the game I spent my time on was Triangle Strategy. I essentially played through it 4 times to get every single unit, play every single map, and then get the golden ending. I can tell you by the 4th New Game Plus I was positively sick of replaying the common maps shared between all routes over and over and over again. So anyways, Triangle Strategy could have really benefited from the world mechanic that Tactics Ogre Reborn has, which is ironic for all the inspiration that Triangle Strategy takes from Tactics Ogre. This was the one thing that it didn't take. The world mechanic lets you jump back into any point of the story and pick a different story decision. This is a cool mechanic and it saves you from the trouble of having to replay the entire game from the start to get everything, including content that you've missed or locked yourself out of due to story choices. Knowing this going into your first playthrough is great because you won't have to stress yourself out over important plot choices. You can just get it later. Speaking of plot, I'm going to talk about the story next, but I'm going to have to make another aside, and I'm going to have to disclaimer and preface this section by saying I'm not a huge plot person and I'm even less of a character person. I think it's clear from lurking different forums, especially the Fire Emblem ones, that a lot of players prioritize character development more than I do, and I'm more of an anomaly, I guess. To each their own, though. Bottom line is, I will pay attention to the plot, I just don't think too hard about it and I don't analyze it like it's English class. Okay, actually about the plot. Man, I don't get what's going on half the time. Plot is kind of convoluted, there are a million factions and I simply couldn't follow. I really want to provide some sort of examples to dumpster on, but I can't even give a solid example. Really, all I got from the main plot is that there's an island continent, there's a bunch of factions that hate each other, you're a small town boy and you eventually fight the power and unite the continent. And then somehow the final boss is an imprisoned godlike being because it's a JRPG and you gotta kill God at some point. Everything more detailed than that loses me. I can't tell you what faction a character is part of, I can't tell you what the motivations of a particular faction is, and when the story tells me to storm a castle, I can't tell you why, I just do it. Part of the reason might be because the dialogue is in King James Bible English. For some dialogue I get the gist of what they're saying, but I don't really grasp the details, and you know the devil's in the details. There's an opening cinematic that goes over the backstory of the continent and the things that led up to the game, but similar to how they front load all the mechanics, they also front load a truck ton of lore immediately, and it's really hard to absorb everything when you're going into the game blind. I enjoyed the story, but only at a very shallow level. There's clearly a depth to the story that makes it go from good to amazing, but everything just went over my head. This is squarely a me problem though. The one last thing that I'll talk about is that this game has a lot of content, as I have mentioned over and over again about how I'm 150 hours in and I'm still not done the post-game. The base game took me around 120 and I didn't even spend too much time grinding for anything specific or going that deep into side dungeons. The post-game is going to be even longer than the main game, which is ridiculous. I will admit they padded the content a little bit by having a lot of forced encounters between plot battles. For example, if the story says something like, alright, we're gonna storm this castle and we're gonna rescue my sister, then you have to traverse maybe 3 or 4 battles to get to the castle where there's another 3 or 4 battles waiting for you. During the main game, I don't mind this because the battles are fun. I think it gets a little bit egregious in the optional late game dungeons, especially Palace of the Dead. It's got like 100 floors and story relevant battles only happen maybe every 5 to 10 floors. Everything in between is just a map with enemies that most people will probably just auto battle through. Overall, in conclusion, love the game. Best $30 I've ever spent, and I don't think I've ever bought a single player game at that price point and gotten this much out of it, and still be barely halfway through the content that it has to offer. With that said, it's a remaster of a remake of a 30-year-old game, and it definitely shows. It's a little clunky and the first 1 to 2 hours were definitely rough if you're coming in from modern era games, but once you get the hang of it, absolutely amazing. Definitely lives up to its self-proclaimed title of the crown jewel of the genre.